The Wild West showdown, where life or death depended upon who could draw their shooting iron first, is a standard trope in Western movies, perhaps made most famous in the 1952 classic High Noon, but repeated many times since. Actually, two gunmen drawing on each other in the middle of the street was a relatively rare occurrence in the Wild West. But it did happen, and many historians agree that the first such example occurred on July 21st, 1865. It involved one of the most famous gunfighters in history. The Hickok-Tut gunfight in the town square of Springfield, Missouri is history that deserves to be remembered.
The initial report in the Springfield, Missouri Weekly Patriot was surprisingly brief. Davis Tutt of Yellville, Arkansas, was shot on the public square at 6:00 p.m. on Friday last by James B. Hickok, better known in southwest Missouri as Wild Bill. The difficulty occurred from a game of cards. Reports in other newspapers were just as brief, although the Springfield Journal added the detail Tutt was shot through the chest and died immediately. It was scant detail, compounded by the fact that the transcript from the subsequent trial seems not to have been preserved, for what many historians argue was the first of the quickdraw duels that films imply happen much more frequently than real history records. Modern attempts to reconstruct the events generally derive from two sources, neither of which are entirely reliable. An 1867 article in Harper's Weekly, authored by George Ward Nichols, a former Union officer turned journalist and historian, and The History of Greene County, Missouri, by former Union officer turned historian Return Ira Holcomb, published in 1883. Nichols, in particular, received criticism for exaggerating Hickok's reputation. And while they disagree on much, they share certain details that say much about the history that surrounds the Wild West legends duel with Davis Tutt. The two were a product of their place and time. Holcomb explains, for some time after the close of the war, Springfield was the resort of many hard characters. Adventurers of every sort came in and met the ruffians of both armies, who, lately disbanded, were seeking a livelihood by any means, not involving hard work. Nichols and Holcomb have divergent opinions of Hickok. Holcomb writes, by nature a ruffian, he soon became a desperado, a drunken, swaggering fellow who delighted when on spree to frighten nervous men and timid women. As note of his lawlessness, Holcomb writes that a favorite diversion of his was to ride his horse on sidewalks and into saloons, hotels, stores, and other public places, and make the animal lie down and perform other tricks, to the infinite delight, no doubt, of the proprietors, none of whom, unfortunately, had the grit to blow the bully's head off. Nichols had a more charitable opinion, quoting an Army officer named Captain Honesty. They say Bill is wild. Now, he isn't any such thing. I've known him for going on 10 year, and he's as civil a disposed person as you'll find hereabouts. But he won't be put upon. But of course, as the newspaper made clear, Hickok already had the nickname Wild Bill, likely adopted after he was involved in a shooting in 1861, for which he was tried and acquitted on grounds of self-defense. The relationship between Tutt and Hickok is likewise a matter of dispute. In part of the country still reeling from war, they had fought on different sides. Hickok had fought for the Union. The Weekly Patriot wrote that he had been engaged since his 16th year, with the exception of about 2 years, with Russell, Majors, and Waddell in government service as a scout, guide, or with exploring parties, and has rendered most efficient and signal service to the Union cause. Tutt, on the other hand, served with the Confederacy in Company A of the 27th Arkansas Infantry. Holcomb writes that Tutt was a ruffian and a crack pistol shot. He was said to have gotten in his work not only on Federal soldiers, but on citizens who had crossed the path against his protest. Holcomb contends that the two had been friends. The two men were boon companions for a time. The one touch of ruffianism made them both akin. They walked the streets together, they drank together, they gambled together. While he notes that Hickok had said, when the war closed, I buried the hatchet, and I won't fight now unless I'm put upon, Nichols doesn't claim the two were friends. Rather, he argues that the two had a dispute grounded in the war, writing that Captain Honesty said, you see, Bill was a scout on our side during the war, and Tutt was a Reb scout. Bill had killed Tutt's mate, and between one thing and t'other, there was an unusual hard feeling atwixt them. Ever since Dave came back, he had tried to pick a row with Bill. Some authors argue that there was also an issue over a woman, possibly over an affair that Hickok had with Tutt's sister, or with attention that Tutt was paying to Susanna Moore, who was involved with Hickok. However, neither Nichols nor Holcomb mentions this, except that Nichols writes without explanation that There was an undercurrent of a woman in that fight. Rather, the bone of contention, both agree, was a watch, although they again disagree over how it came to be involved. Holcomb writes that both Tutt and Hickok were gamblers, and good ones, although the ex-Confederate was the more proficient of the two. Holcomb writes that on the night of the 20th of July, the two men played poker in a room at Lion House on South Street. Hickok was the loser. First his money went, then his watch, a fine gold hunting-cased Waltham, with a flashy chain and seal, and then his diamond pin and ring. He rose from the table completely strapped and much irritated and crestfallen. Nichols tells a completely different story. Again, quoting Honesty, he writes, Bill was up in his room, playing 7-Up or Forehand or some of them pesky games. Bill refused to play with Tutt, who was a professional gambler, but Dave stood over the man who was gambling with Bill and lent the feller money. Bill won about $200, which made Tutt spiteful mad. Bime, he says to Bill, Bill, you got plenty of money. Pay me that $40 you owe me in that horse trade. And Bill paid him. And then he said, you owe me $35 more you lost playing with me the other night. Dave's style was right provoking, but Bill answered him perfectly gentlemanly. I think you're wrong, Dave. It's only $25. I have a memorandum of it in my pocket downstairs. If it's $35, I'll pay you. Now, Bill's watch was lying on the table. Dave took up the watch, put it in his pocket, and said, I'll keep your watch till you pay me that $35. This made Bill shoot mad, for don't you see, it was a doubting his honor like. So he got up and looked Dave in the eyes and said to him, I don't want to make a row in this house. It's a decent house, and I don't want to injure the keeper. You better put that watch back on the table. But Dave grinned at Bill mighty ugly and walked off with that watch. While the two authors disagree over how the watch came into Tutt's possession, they both agree that Hickok told him not to wear it around town, which would have been a way of mocking Bill. Holcomb writes, Bill asked him as a special favor not to wear it publicly or let people know that it changed owners, as he felt bad enough already and didn't want the evidence of his misfortune or his ill luck of bad playing flaunted in everybody's face. Tutt laughed a mocking laugh at Bill's humiliation and assured him that it would give him as much pleasure to wear that watch in the streets as it had already given him to win it. I intend on wearing it in the morning. Bill replied with an oath. If you do, I'll shoot you, and I warn you not to come across the square with it on. The two men parted and retired to their rooms to put fresh caps on their revolvers. Nichols instead writes that Tutt's friends spent time trying to provoke Bill into a fight, but they couldn't provoke Bill into a row as he's afraid of himself when he gets awful mad, and he always left his shooting irons in his room when he went out. One day these cusses drew their pistols on him and dared him to a fight, and they told him that Tutt was going to pack that watch across the square the next day at noon. By Nichols' account, Captain Honesty found Bill cleaning and greasing and loading his revolvers and said, Now, Bill, you're going to get into a fight. And Bill responded, Don't you bother yourself, Captain. It's not the first time I've been in a fight, and these hounds have put on long enough. You don't want me to give up my honor, do you? The next day, Hickok found Tutt in the town square wearing the watch. A fight was inevitable. Holcomb described the fight. Just as Tutt reached the corner of the courthouse and Campbell Street, Bill called out, Dave, don't you come across here with that watch. Tutt, as some say, drew his pistol, and almost instantly Bill fired, using one arm as a rest for his revolver. Tutt fell, shot nearly through the heart, and died very soon. Some depose that Tutt's revolver was out of his scabbard when the body was first examined, that Tutt had fired first. One chamber of the revolver was empty, and there were those who swore that they heard 2 pistol shots. Nichols writes, about 15 paces brought them opposite each other and about 15 yards apart. Tutt then showed his pistol. Bill kept a sharp eye on him, and before Tutt could point it, Bill had his out. At that moment you could have heard a pin drop in that square. Both Tutt and Bill fired, but one discharge followed the other so quick that it's hard to say which went out first. Tutt was a famous shot, but he missed this time. The ball from his pistol went over Bill's head. The instant Bill fired, without waiting to see if he had hit Tutt, he wheeled on his heels and pointed his pistol at Tutt's friends, who had already drawn their weapons. Aren't you satisfied, gentlemen? Said Bill, cool as an alligator. Put up your shooting irons, or there'll be more dead men here. Nichols and Holcomb disagree on another point as well. Nichols writes that Bill was such a good shot that Tutt's death was certain. He was plucky a fellow as ever drew trigger, but Lord bless her, it was no use. Bill never shoots twice at the same man. While Holcomb has a completely different opinion, writing, Bill's shot was a fine one, but it is said by those who knew him well that it was a chance shot. For it is averred that when here, Wild Bill was not considered a crack shot at all, and that his shot which killed Tutt at a distance of 75 yards was an accident. Both Nichols and Holcomb agree that Bill gave over his pistol and turned himself into the sheriff. The report by Greene County Coroner J.F. Brown survives and is available on the website of the Missouri Secretary of State. It concludes, "To the Honorable the Judge of the Circuit Court of Greene County, the undersigned asked to inform you that one Davis K. Tutt was killed yesterday by one James B. Hickok. As coroner of Greene County, I impaneled a jury to investigate the cause of the death of said Davis K. Tutt. The jury, after hearing the evidence, makes the following return, that said Tutt came to his death in a manner and means of a pistol shot, and the jury further find that the said violence causing said death was committed by a certain James B. Hickok." The report gives the accounts of several witnesses, but none seem to have known for sure if Tutt fired, nor seen the shooting directly. Hickok was subsequently tried in the court of Honorable John S. Phelps. Nichols does not mention the trial, but Holcomb writes the empty chamber of Tutt's revolver was exhibited, and upon the ground of reasonable doubt that Hickok was the aggressor, the jury acquitted him. The Weekly Patriot was frustrated with the verdict, writing, "The trial of William Hickok for the killing of Davis Tutt on the streets of this city weeks before last was concluded on Saturday last by a verdict of not guilty, rendered from the jury in about 10 minutes after they retired to the jury room." That the defendant engaged in the fight willingly, it seems, is not disputed, and lawyers say, and the court instructed the jurors to the same effect, that he was not entitled to an acquittal on the ground of self-defense, unless he was anxious to avoid the fight and used all reasonable means to do so. But the jury seems to have thought differently. The verdict did raise questions. Holcomb writes, "A prominent attorney harangued the crowd from the balcony of the courthouse and denounced the verdict as against the evidence in all decency, and there were threats of lynching Bill, but nothing was done, and he was allowed to live." But the verdict can be seen in the context of the time and location. Nichols writes, "In order to give the reader a clear understanding of the condition of this neighborhood which could have permitted the duel mentioned, I will describe the situation at time of which I am writing, which was late in the summer of 1865, premising that this section of the country would not today be selected as a model example of modern civilization. At that time, peace and comparative quiet had succeeded the perils of tumults of war in all the more southern states. The people of Georgia and the Carolinas were glad to enforce order in their midst, and it would have been safe for a Union officer to have ridden unattended through the land. In southwest Missouri, there were old scores to settle up. Revenge for the past and security for the future knotted many a nerve and sped many a deadly bullet." Holcomb sees the verdict in the context of the war. There were those, however, who asserted that Hickok was cleared because he was an ex-Federal and a radical, and the man he shot was a rebel, and the jury were all men who could take the Drake Oath, referring to the loyalty oath required of Missouri citizens after the war. Despite their disdain for the outcome of the trial, the Weekly Patriot acknowledges that the acquittal represented the nature of the town and times, writing, "Public opinion has much to do with the administration of justice, and when those whose sense of justice and respect for the law should prompt them to speak out and control public sentiment fail to do so, whether from fear or indifference, we think they should not complain of others." The newspaper asserts that the citizens of Springfield failed to express the horror and disgust they felt, not out of indifference, but from fear and timidity. The gunfight, a rare and perhaps first example of the classic slap-weather quick-draw match, was a product of history. The context of the time and place dictated both the propensity to fight and the outcome of the trial that followed. As historian Richard O'Connor wrote in 1959, "Nothing better described the times than the fact that dangling a watch held as security for a poker debt was widely regarded as a justifiable provocation for resorting to firearms."
The willingness of Western juries to, regardless of the actual law, acquit a man if it appeared to have been a fair fight is one place where Hollywood movies and history might match, though of course at other times frontier justice was meted out at the end of a rope. Perhaps as interesting is the divergence between the two nearly contemporary accounts. Was Wild Bill Hickok, a man who became famous as a Western gambler, actually a lousy gambler who had been cleaned out and was just trying to protect his vanity? Or did Tutt steal the watch because he was mad that Wild Bill was winning, forcing Wild Bill to defend his honor? Was Wild Bill Hickok, a man famous as a Western gunfighter, a crack shot who never had to shoot at the same man twice? Or was he a lousy shot who succeeded only by chance? Nichols' account of the gunfight in the life of Wild Bill that was published in Harper's Weekly is credited with creating the Wild Bill myth, but of course that would never have occurred if Tutt had been a better shot. Or, of course, if society hadn't allowed it, as Stephen Lubet, a professor of law at Northwestern University, wrote in a 2001 edition of the UCLA Law Review. If William Butler Hickok and others like him had been convicted and jailed or hanged, then there would have been no opportunity for dime novelists and Hollywood producers to grow rich by exaggerating their adventures. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.